Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. This is Jim McKeith, and welcome to the first of what I hope is many of our Delphi developer debates. Today, we are talking about free and nil. And the impetus for this was, oh gosh, I can't remember what it was, but I was doing a Q&A session with Nick Hodges, and he mentioned that he doesn't like free and nil, never uses it, no one should use it. And I thought, that's kind of interesting, an interesting topic. And I'm like, I use free and nil. I think that it has its uses, but maybe other people agree with Nick. So that's the purpose here today, is we're going to are about together a number of MVPs. We have, looks like about 15 MVPs on here today to discuss this. And the slides are available in the handout section. You can download the slides and see what everybody had to say in detail, and post your questions and we'll discuss it in detail. So if you're not familiar with free and nil, it does what it says on the tin. It takes an object and frees it and assigns it to nil. There's the code. There's the doc wiki page for it. So we did a survey of the MVPs, and this is what I got back from the MVPs, that the majority of them frequently use free and nil and frequently check with assigned, but the largest portion of them do. But there are people that rarely use it or never use it on both sides here. So there is some controversy, it would appear. So grouping them together just into pros and cons, this is kind of where it comes down at. So we see, again, it's pretty close to half and half that are either use it a lot or use it sparingly. Did a survey of attendees as well. So everybody that registered, if you went through the registration process, there's 2 different registration processes apparently. So some people didn't get a chance to fill out the survey, but we see here that attendees are frequently, 34% are frequently. So over half are frequently or occasionally using it. There's a few attendees also that never use it or rarely use it as well. And we can see you have a comparison here between the attendees and the MVPs. We see for the most part, they're pretty close actually. And same thing with free and nil. We see frequently being used, always being used, but then also some nevers and rarelys. So I was going to go through real quick, and like I said, the full slides are in here, and everybody went through and had some details about why they said what they said, but you can see where everybody comes down in here. Few MVPs are the only way to free an object, free and nil. Frequent users of free and nil here. Occasional users of free and nil. And rare users are free and nil. Never uses free and nil. It depends. And then it depends. Yeah, okay. So actually, let's see, where was the only way to free an object? Never. Okay, yep. All right, there we go. Never. I thought I missed one. So with that, let's go ahead and discuss this. Hopefully we have a fairly civil discussion here. And yes, Jean-Luc Picard is now an MVP. We can see joining us today. That's going by the name of Ian Barker. And so actually, Nick, since you kind of sparked this off, what's your opinion on free and nil? And why should everybody agree with you?
Well, my opinion on free and nil is that you should write your code in such a way that it is never necessary. I don't say don't use it, because if you've written your code in such a way that it is necessary, then it's probably a very good idea to use it. My position is that nothing should ever be nil. You should never let anything at any time in your code be nil. Now, I recognize that there's legacy systems, that there's people have been writing code in such a way that it could be nil. Things can be nil. I guess when I say never, I'm saying in new code, whenever you're writing your code, if you're writing a free and nil, if you think, oh, I better write free and nil here, then you probably need to rethink how it is you're building things. Everybody knows I'm a big advocate of dependency injection. So if you use dependency injection, you never have to worry about anything being nil, because you just check this, you do a guard check, and if it is nil, then you refuse to accept it. And nothing ever ends up being nil, and then you never have to worry about calling is assigned, or if something doesn't equal nil, then go ahead and do it or whatever. And free and nil becomes something you don't need to do.
So you never have any like optional objects in your code, like that, if you have, a class that is composed of several objects, that may not all be necessary at some point in time. They should still all be created, even if you never use them.
I would recommend using a dummy version of the class to create it so that it's not nil. That's correct. A no-op version of the class, and have that be the starting point for that class, for that object.
Well, I would say that is pretty unrealistic in real life scenarios. I mean, imagine having a very large tree hierarchy where leaves, if you don't have a child, it is a nil, and nil is a valid value. So you would create a dummy, and then you would have to check whether or not that dummy is actually something like a nil, or it is,
or is it a dummy, right?
Dummy. So basically, you are delaying your problem to another level, but you still have to check whether or not this object is a dummy or it is not a dummy. So I don't think that is very effective. I mean, certainly you can avoid a range of problems if you create dummy objects, and in some circumstances having such objects where you don't have to check whether it is nil or not, or it is created or not, makes sense, but it is not all-encompassing solution.
Now, if I remember correctly, I think Ian Barker, didn't you say something about with dependency injection, you saw that you needed to have check for assigned and free and nil more in that case? Is that right? Am I remembering correctly?
Well, there's two things. If you're going to use dependency injection, then interfaces. And I know Nick's on today, so this is Nick will love this. If you can, use interfaces, but I work on lots of different projects, and I don't always get to choose what's happening in the entire code base. And if you're using dependency injection properly, then you're coding to interfaces, which is one area where Nick and I totally agree. But actually, you don't always get that choice. And if you are going to have something sent into your code, then by definition, you don't always have control over that object, and you don't always have control that what's being injected into your code is in any way valid whatsoever. It should be, but of course life isn't like that. And if you start trying to manipulate objects and classes that have been injected into your code, that's when it can all go horribly wrong. So you shouldn't be freeing and nilling it anyway inside your code. Dependency injection is about using the things that have been sent to you rather than killing them. But as I say, in a real world project where you've got lots of other competing methodologies and things like that, there are some circumstances under which you don't have control over when you're going to free or nil something. I don't know. I mean, I can't think of any other use where free and nil on an object you haven't created is valid. If it's something that you're destroying, where did it come from? If you didn't create it, then why are you destroying it? And maybe when the application's shutting down or something like that, I can see that. But certainly saying if assigned on things is actually quite important as well when you're dealing with things like callbacks and stuff like that, where you're calling a weird sort of calling mechanism. But yeah, interfaces, then you don't have to worry about all this.
Isn't that just memory management techniques in general?
Yeah.
I don't think it's really about free and nil. Let me put it like this: if you're the only driver on the road and there are no obstacles and no other people on the road, and you're always driving carefully, never hitting the speed limit, and you have the safe driver sticker in your driver license, then there would be absolutely no reason for using FreeAndNil. But as soon as there are other people entering the road and you don't know how skillful they are and if they are safe drivers, then it might make sense to, well, introduce even a rule saying, oh, you have to wear a safety belt. Oh, excuse me, use FreeAndNil. I mean, I see it just like that. I see so much client code, and of course, I can write code which never needs FreeAndNil, but I usually do because I never know who's actually modifying my code, who's using my code, and if they are, well, just regular developers and just for juniors not knowing what's going on behind the scenes, well, just make them use FreeAndNil. It's ugly, it's costing a little bit more time to apply, and it's a little bit inconvenient, but in the end, it's like the safety belt in the car. It's the same discussion for me.
It depends if you do a lot of work on legacy projects as well that are big, where there are multiple developers involved with lots of old code bases that you are not really allowed to change because you go, oh my God, this is awful. I want to burn it down to the ground and rewrite it properly. Differently, shall we say? And that happens to me a lot. You know, I inherit code regularly.
But a safety belt is fine to a point. But what I think, because in prepping for this, I did a search for FreeAndNil in the source, just to see. You know, I hadn't done that in a very long time, and I've been operating under certain principles in guiding how I write my own components and software and applications. But I was surprised at the, I'm going to call it excessive use of FreeAndNil in the VCL code, especially in destructors, which at first I was like, why the heck are we doing that? Because I look at that and I'm like, oh, this must not be a member field. This must be a component reference, so that if I'm being destroyed, then I'm clearing that out because someone else might be using it. But I go and look and no, it's just a member object. Instead of calling free, you know, my owning object is being destroyed. Doing the extra work to nil out that reference doesn't give us any value. That reference is gone. And so I think the fact is, yes, there's no harm, but it's adding, you know, extra processing that's really not giving us any advantage. But for me, when I go back and look at that, I have to pause and think, is this code doing something else that I'm not expecting? And from a maintainability point of view, that's one of the objections I have of overuse of FreeAndNil.
Yeah, every time you see FreeAndNil, you have to think to yourself, why is FreeAndNil being called here?
Yeah, exactly. Who else is using this?
Yeah.
I agree with Ray. Yes.
Yeah.
This is main thing. If you use FreeAndNil in places where it shouldn't be used, then you are obscuring the intent of the code. Next developer that comes in will have to ask himself, what is this code doing? Why is this nil here? Is it being accessed after that or not? But there are also places where nil and FreeAndNil is valid, and instead of being used for debugging purposes. For instance, in VCL, there are a lot of examples of such usage. When you have a list of children in VCL, you create those, I think it is called generic collection or some other list. They are created only when there is some child to be added. So when you add a child, you first check if a list is nil. Then if it is nil, you create it, and then you add that child. And vice versa. If you are removing the child from the collection, and it is the last child, then you will free and nil that collection, so it doesn't occupy unnecessary memory. When you have plenty of components, that makes sense. And when you have to process such list, you check whether it is assigned or not. If it is not assigned, that means there are no children and you don't have to do anything. So that is very valid example of using if assigned, using nil as valid value and using free and nil to destroy an object.
Yeah, the few times I ever recall running into it where it was frequently used would have been a case where somebody's using the objects property of a t-string list to store a huge collection of object references that they're passing back and forth. Yeah, you want to check, oh, is it assigned? If it is, okay, free and nil. But other than that, the only other time I recall really running into it was we had a bug in the, I think it was in the panel list where dynamically creating panels was causing an access violation when those panels were being destroyed, and there was some sort of interaction between free and nil and just regular free. And I remember Chuck and I spent a couple hours looking that over. We just couldn't find what was going on with that.
Yeah, for me it's all. Oh, sorry.
So real quick, somebody said that apparently they don't see the names. I thought the names would be visible. So I'm going to go through and just read everybody's name off real quick to make sure everybody knows who the people here that are talking. So I'm going to start with Holger in the yellow shirt there. Good wave, Holger. Holger Flick. Dr. Holger Flick. Ian Barker is disguised as Jean-Luc Picard. Just finished talking was Thomas Theobald. Dalia Krasnicker, which I never get your name right. She's written a few books, recently the thread safety one. Then Olaf Monin, there. Ray Konopka is next. Eric Van Bilsen, who I just cut off. Andrea Magni. Nick Hodges. And Frank Lauer. And then there's a few others as well that are just on a voice. So if you do, if I haven't introduced you yet, if you do have something to share, just introduce yourself real quick the first time. That'd be great. All right, sorry, go ahead, Eric. And I'm going to mute everybody else because we're getting some background noise here. So unmute yourself when you want to talk.
Okay, yeah, you can cut me off anytime. Yeah, for me, the free and nil, it's mostly about object lifetime. I totally agree. If you have a class that contains a couple of objects, you create those objects in the constructor, you free them in the destructor, and you just use free. There's no point at all in using free and nil there. But as I said before, if you have objects which can be nil because they are not applicable all the time, and you have the situation where you need to the lifetime of the parent object exceeds the lifetime of the child object, to call it that way. So I see Nick Hodges. You have situations where you have an object that you need to free because you no longer need it, but it's still a member of the parent class, for example. Well, you can set it to nil manually after you destroy it, like free, and then set it to nil, and then you can later check, hey, if it's assigned, then you can do something. If it's not assigned, you don't need to do something with it. This is compared to having a dummy object for that situation. In that case, I think free and nil is a good solution. It does both in one step. And one thing I like about free and nil is that it sets the reference to nil before it actually frees the object, which can sometimes be beneficial in multi-threaded situations. So I prefer to use free and nil in that case instead of manually freeing it and manually setting the instance to nil. But if you have a situation where you create all your objects in the constructor and you destroy them all in the destructor, I totally agree. There's no need for free and nil at all, and it just wastes the CPU cycles. Some people, may know me as somebody who writes high performance code. So I really try cut down on CPU cycles, will also cut down on memory uses, and that's why one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of dummy objects. So because you create objects that don't do anything, other than just call into methods that don't do anything either, right? And that's also a bit of a CPU, unnecessary CPU. But so is checking for nil. So all in all, whether you use it or not, I'm not big on one side or the other. I use it regularly if I need to free an object which is no longer in use, which I could keep around, but there's just no use in keeping it around because I'm done with it. Then I set the reference to nil. That's my
Unmuted.
I have to say, Stefan Glenke, who we all know very well, is a very outspoken MVP sometimes. He has some quite strong opinions on things. He says, the Wikipedia article even has this statement: obsessive and redundant checks for null values or testing whether a collection is empty before iterating its values may be a sign of cargo cults programming. I love that phrase. That's very good. But yeah, Stefan, very, very smart guy. I think all MVPs know who he is. And yeah, he had some quite strong opinions on the whole free and nil situation. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm actually reading a book right now by Richard Feynman, who Nobel Prize winner, done a lot of cool stuff in physics. And he talks a lot about cargo cult physics, if you will, and actually uses that term as well. And it comes from during the war, these planes would come in with these cargo planes that come with all this great stuff. And so some of the people there didn't understand where the planes came from. And so they developed these religions, or whatever you want to call them, around where they would create fake runways and all these things trying to cause the gods of the planes, the cargo planes, to show up because they didn't understand the source. And so it's kind of this idea of doing things without understanding the reasoning behind it. And so I'm a real big believer in evidence-based programming, right? And if you don't know, so if you have an object that's coming into you, right, you may not know if it's assigned or not. That's a good valid choice for if assigned. But if there's an object that you understand the life cycle of, that you're managing the life cycle of, and you know doesn't need to be free and nil, doesn't need to have the assigned checks, then adding those in there just in case isn't useful. And so I think that you should know exactly what's the possibilities, what's my possible inputs, and then only code around those behaviors, those possible paths. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on the topic.
And that's where assertions are really useful.
I think the real question is, do we take a look at the code from a pro side, or from a junior developer, or from a beginner? I think that's a major difference. So everybody might agree that we know the lifetime of our objects, right? But are you sure that the junior programmer understands the lifetime of whatever a string list that is created in a form and perhaps is freed sometime? And is there an event firing on exit and on resize or whatever that is fired unexpectedly and trying to use the string list? So there's a good point to use free and nil from my point of view, especially if you are using this on mobile in combination with lazy init. On mobile, there's an event where you have to freeze memory because the operating system wants to have possible memory from your back. So if you have a guarding object that is creating your business logic objects, you might freeze these objects in case these empty memory event is fired, and you want to nil this object, because if your application is in the foreground again, you may create this by lazy init again. So okay, you can use free and collect the information in a Boolean, but that makes no sense. So why no? Nil is also a state, so use free and nil and you're perfectly good. I totally agree to Eric about the extra CPU cycles. If you are writing a 3D engine and you have to count the CPU cycles, you won't use the extra call for FreeAndNil. But to be honest, most of the Delphi developers are using business application where they don't care at all how many CPU cycles is burned by a form. So I fully understand Nick and Ray's opinion on if you look at the code and you imagine if there is a FreeAndNil, you imagine there must be some weird object lifetime. But if you are familiar and using FreeAndNil all the time, not my use, but if you're using FreeAndNil all over your code, nobody cares if there's a FreeAndNil, and nobody thinks about what has the senior programmer in mind why he's using FreeAndNil and not free. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents.
Well, there is downside. FreeAndNil only nils the reference you passed in, and it gives you a false sense of security. If you have other references to that object, they will not become nil and will become dangling pointers. So in a way, telling people who don't understand how FreeAndNil works to use it everywhere to avoid problems is bad advice, because they can have dangling pointers they are not aware of. And for debugging purposes, there are better tools. You have fast memory management, FastMM in full debug mode, where you can detect dangling pointers, access of references that are released earlier. So there are other tools for debugging purposes that are much better than using FreeAndNil. And I also wanted to say something to Eric. He said he is using FreeAndNil in multi-threading, and FreeAndNil is not thread safe. So while it can sometimes maybe help you, it is not thread safe in the multi-threaded code, so it doesn't do anything there for you.
I'd like to, I'll make one quick point. If your junior developers are writing string list, T-string list code that is leaving that pointer hanging all over the place, time for a code review.
Yeah.
I think Andrea wants to make a point as well, don't you?
Just, first of all, hi to everybody. I just want to say I share most of the opinions you said, and I just want to say a little things. I'm a very FreeAndNil guy. If you look at my code on GitHub or the like, it's filled with FreeAndNil everywhere, even in destructors. But it's a sort of habit I think I've grown up with. And I was thinking about why. And I guess that I'm using less and less FreeAndNil since the introduction of inline variables, because I think that I started using FreeAndNil because I wanted to fail soon and better in the case I was freeing an object instance, and then at some point I was making the mistake of using that object again. Ron, can you still hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The webcam is gone.
Your webcam. Oh, you're back now.
So I was saying, if you have some code you call FreeAndNil, and then for some reason you have some other code that is still using that instance, you will get an exception immediately at the first run of your program. So I think that was a habit I had. And now, if you can use an inline variable, given it's out of scope, right after the block you define the variable, I feel safer not using FreeAndNil in that situation. But I mean, for example, I wouldn't say that looking at a FreeAndNil call in a destructor would make me think that there's some other use of that reference somewhere. I think I can see the point that one may argue why the developer really wanted to destroy the object and free the reference and have a nil reference there. But personally, I wouldn't look for other use of that reference. It's just It's just, I think, something that is from a personal point of view. I mean, however, this discussion, I think this discussion is very useful because even if it's it seems a very small point, but I think there's something that is about even Delphi history. I mean, if I was using Delphi 7, I think I would use FreeAndNil. With inline variables, I'm not sure I would use FreeAndNil all the times, but I mean, we are all grown plants, so I'm not sure I will stop using FreeAndNil tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think the only case, though, that I've ever really felt like I needed it was in, say, and I will have to defer to Dahlia on this one because she's a much bigger expert on threading than I am. But in cases where I have had let's say, a series of reference objects that are being touched by a host of threads that I'm operating, if one of those reference objects needs to be freed, I'll call nil on it, and in my threads, I'll include an if assigned, merely because I want those threads to know, is that thing still there? Do I risk blowing up if I try to touch it? That's the only case where I could think of where I might really use it. The rest of the time, I'm just going to trust that as soon as I fall out of scope, my object's gone. I don't have to worry about it anymore. You're muted, Dahlia.
You are making a mistake here because it is not thread safe, like I said, and you cannot use it in multi-threaded scenarios. So if you need to protect your object references in some other way, you need to lock them, then call FreeAndNil, then unlock any access to shared references like that. You cannot call FreeAndNil on unprotected object, because there is a slight chance that while you are nilling that value, that another object passed if assigned test and is going to do something, and the next moment, boom, your object is gone. So
that's a really good point. Thank you.
So this will not work. But you can use interface references in such cases. If you have a reference counted class and interface reference, when you nil such reference, it will be thread safe. So nilling interface reference is thread safe. Assigning interface reference is not thread safe, but nilling it is.
This is all from her book, which is a very interesting book as well. I have to say something as well along these lines as well, which is a few people have said, you know what is happening with your objects. And I think we need to be clear here what we mean by our objects, because there is no such thing as your objects unless it's completely local. And particularly I'm pointing to Dahlia on the screen. I don't know why, but particularly in the case of Dahlia's book, she makes the point that actually nearly everything, in effect, is a global object or something like that, and except in very small sets of circumstances. And as soon as you do not own that thing directly within that particular part of a thread that you're looking at, then it becomes unsafe in threading. And when people say, oh, well, you know the lifetime of your objects. No, you don't, unless your object or your class is completely self-contained and there's no code that operates anywhere outside of your particular control, then it's not your object. And in fact, there's probably very few circumstances under which you can definitely say, this is mine, I can do what I like with it, I can free it, I can create it. And if you create it, and then it goes off and gets used by something else, then at some point that object can be destroyed and freed, and you do not have control over it. So when you say our objects, there is very rarely a situation where that's a true statement. Interface.
Another reason for using interfaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. This is why in most reasonably sophisticated and complicated code, you're probably going to want to use interfaces because it makes life a heck of a lot easier. And as Dalia said, in many cases, it's thread safe as well, which helps as well. And it cuts down a lot of the worry about memory, memory usage and dangling pointers here and there and memory blocks of code. I mean, you should always turn on, the memory checks anyway, so that you're not, everybody's done it. They've forgotten something that they should have destroyed, and all of a sudden you get a load of little things saying, hey, did you know all these things were not created, which is usually a bad smell about something's wrong with your code. But interfaces really does solve a lot of these problems. And years ago, I didn't ever use them. Now I'm quite a big fan of them, and I totally convert to the idea. It's not always appropriate to use them, but it's very rare that you can't.
So there's a question that came in from the attendees about C++. Of the MVPs are on screen right now, how many of you do a lot of C++ or consider yourself well-versed in C++? Nope. Okay. So just some comments about C++. Anybody else?
This is the guy. We should have Yilmaz on here because he's the resident expert in C++, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are some differences in C++ as well, as pointed out by some others as well, unique pointer and such. So anyway, yeah.
Dalia, call me wrong. Interface objects are thread safe, you just said. But combining interface object with weak reference, you are not thread safe anymore, right?
Yes, weak references are not thread safe. So you cannot take a strong reference from weak reference in a thread safe manner. That is impossible.
So is there a trick to?
No.
Oh, okay.
It is simply impossible because there is no way you can reference counting in interface is going through virtual call through addref, and you cannot do that on nil reference, and there is a whole lot of things going on, and you cannot do that atomically without any locking mechanism. So
okay, so but
and while you're trying to take a strong reference from that weak reference, if last strong reference goes out of scope, it will destroy the object. So that is the problem. This is the problem where it is not thread safe.
Okay. Besides the weak problem, you just said FreeAndNil is some kind of false safety because if you have a second reference to the object, this reference is not niled. Okay, so agree. But in these cases, like Nick said, this is kind of need for code refactoring. But if you have laying around object references all over the place, you should use a reference counted object, right? So
yes, if you have shared object that you need to use and share around, then you can use interfaces, and the last holder will still have a valid object. So in that part, that is thread safe, and reference counting in reference counted classes, of course, if it is implemented with atomic decrement and atomic increment, that is thread safe. So nilling last reference that goes out of scope will be the last object, last reference holding that object. And when it goes out of scope, it can freely destroy the reference. And reference counting will make sure that if you have references to object that when you take strong reference from another strong reference, at the moment it is safe to use it, reference counting will ensure that that reference is safe. But you cannot reuse one reference and assign something to it multiple times and nil it in thread safe manner. The moment you want to assign something, it is no longer thread safe. Only clearing the reference is thread safe.
So before we got started here, Thomas asked a really good question. of, is there an example of when using free and nil could cause problems? And Dalia, you shared some examples, and a couple of questions here from the attendees as well, of is there a reason not to use free and nil even if it's not needed?
Well,
Jim,
one example is when you have a lazily created object and you destroy it in the destructor and you use free and nil, and something else, some code after that during the destruction process access that reference again, and it will magically create it again, then you will have a memory leak. But even if you don't use free and nil in such case, you will have access to dangling reference. So that is a problem on its own, and you need to solve such problem with some other tool. You need to have some flag in VCL. You have a component state destroying. So when you know that the component is in destroying state, you should not create any lazily created instances.
Shouldn't we talk a little bit about what different procedures are there to free or destroy or whatever? I mean, from the questions I see, it seems not everybody seems to be clear on what free and nil actually does, what the replacement is, and what we else have in the box. Why wouldn't you call destroy, or would you call destroy directly? What's the difference to free, and why would you use dispose of possibly? So maybe we just talk a little bit about that so that everybody is really clear on where the differences are that we are, or that we just mentioned in very detail about thread safety and nilling something. So maybe we should do that first. I mean, I can start with dispose of. I had the question several times just in the week before this debate started, because people started thinking about it, and well, the simple answer is you just don't use it anymore. It makes no sense. It just calls free. So there is no reason for dispose of anymore, since art has been killed. Well, the only code that dispose of did useful was only in the case of art. And destroy, I mean, what's the difference between free and destroy? Free checks if the variable is actually nil and only calls destroy on that variable, on that instance, if it's not already nil. So it replaces, or if you're using free, you really don't have to write if assign something, then free something, because that makes no sense. It's already in the code of free. So if you, like Eric, want to save cycles, you always call destroy probably, because you know what you're doing, and you know you have no dangling pointers. So the fastest way to do things is certainly calling destroy directly, because you save a nanosecond probably. But in highly efficient code, you might be doing that.
So there is a place where you must call free and not destroy, and that is during the destruction of an object in destructors, because in Delphi, construction of an object can always fail, and in that case, automatic cleanup is invoked and destructor chain is called, and it must be able to handle partially initialized instances. And if you call destroy in the destructor, you will cause access violation, and chain of destructors will be broken. But not only chain of destructors, a free instance which clears the memory of that object finally when it calls all the destructors will never be called, and you will leak memory, and you cannot recover from that memory leak. So it is absolutely a must that you never ever raise any exceptions that are not handled in the destructor, because it will break the destruction process and it will break your application. And this is also where you have to call if assigned. If you are doing something else besides calling free on an object instance, you need to check whether it is assigned or not before calling any other method, because otherwise you will again raise an exception that will break the process.
And it's like I said, if you exactly know what you're doing, then you can use optimized code of everything. And of course, there's another situation where you shouldn't use destroy, of course. If you are strictly following the try finally pattern for creating things, then of course, in the finally part, you have to call free, or if you prefer free and nil, because it's exactly that. Your variable should be initialized to nil. And if something happens in your try block, then of course you wouldn't want to call the destructor on a variable that has never been, well, instantiated. So that's the other situation that you have to keep in mind.
Well, if you are calling try and finally on single object instance, if you don't have multiple objects that you are constructing, then you can freely call destroy on a local object, because creating the object must happen outside the try.
Yeah.
And so in the finally, it will be assigned. So you can call destroy there, but it is custom to call free, because it is convention to use it instead of destroy. That additional nil check doesn't make a difference. And because there are situations like in Destructor where people don't often know that their object might not be fully initialized, telling people that they can call destroy when they know the object is not nil often leads to code where people use it in places where this is not true. So using free is better than using destroy. But of course, if you are running some tight loop and creating a large number of objects and you want to squeeze every nanosecond out of it, you can, of course, use destroy in such cases.
Yeah,
that basically leads to the discussion how the multiple object try finally pattern should look like, and unfortunately some developers didn't get it right. At least that's what I observed by looking at client code sometimes. They missed to assign nil to the 3 or 4 or 5 variables before going into the try part. So that's of course the precondition that you set it to nil.
But make a guess. What do you think? How many Delphi developers knows that free is checking the pointer if it's nil? I saw so much legacy code where I see if assigned, if assigned then free. Mm-hmm. So many developers won't know that free checks it.
Yeah, I think earlier when we were discussing this before we went live, Nick had a response to that, which to the question about is free and nil dangerous, which really isn't code dependent. It's more of a wastage of meat CPU cycles, in that if somebody comes across the reference of free and nil, okay, why is this here? What's the point of nilling this? What, is there something else using this, and do I have to go hunt something down in my code or in somebody else's code that's referring back to this object reference? What's going on? And that's, it's been a long time since I've done production coding. I'm mostly in the managerial spec of this, so that really rings home with me, because that wastes the most money, and that's the one that I look at and go.
Well, yes, you need to think, you need to know about your code, and you need to think about it when you are writing. So when people ask, should I use free and nil here or not, you have to ask yourself whether nil is a valid value of some reference at some point, and whether some other code can access that reference later on. If it cannot, then you can just call free. But if it is in the middle of the code, if its parent object is its life cycle is longer than the life cycle of that intermediate reference or field which you are dynamically creating or maybe destroying, then you need to nil it because it will be a dangling pointer if you don't. So same goes with if assigned. If nil is valid value, then you need to check whether it is assigned or not. If you are just doing it for debugging purposes, then you use assert because this is used for debugging and not checking if assigned all over the place. But there is one little thing that needs to be mentioned, namely in LLVM-backed compilers, calling something on nil reference will create exception that will not be caught by immediate exception handlers, and it will break your code. LLVM-backed compiler cannot catch such exceptions. Those are hardware exceptions. When you access invalid memory, call something on nil reference, this is the most usual issue. You need to check whether, if you're expecting that some instance will be nil, you need to check if it is assigned before you just run code and think that your try finally or try except will catch it and handle that exception. It will not, and it will break your code. The final code in the finally, if you have try finally, will not be called, so it will create memory leaks and it will bubble up to the next level. So it is very bad. You need to check for nil in such scenarios. So it is documented, but not many people knows that.
There's another question here that says, if you set your form's action to CA free, the close action to free, when you do that, do you need to nil the pointer to the form as well? That's actually, I think, an interesting question. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, if you have CA free in your form, then you don't hold any. You shouldn't hold any reference to that form anywhere. So if it is a global, you don't do that. You create. You can have some local variable for initialization of that form if you need to set up some things, but the minute you show it to the user, you don't touch that reference again. So you don't use global references for that. And if you do use globals for some reason, then you have to nil it in that code. You don't call free and nil because obviously it will destroy it. It is in the process of destruction. But you need to nil the reference in that case, in that callback, because you will have a dangling pointer.
The phrase global pointer just so crazy.
Make hair stand up, huh?
Yeah. Nick's going to explode any minute now.
I'm gonna gouge my eyes out with a spoon.
I can see the steam rising. Yeah. I must say, Marco can too, by the way. He's left now, but he mentioned and said what a good session it was, and we've had quite a lot of the people, the attendees, commenting and saying what a great discussion. So I think, Jim, you hit the nail on the head by picking this subject. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the next topic, when I asked the MVPs what they wanted to talk about next, the most common thing was with statements. So.
You did mention interfaces as well was another subject that we also thought about.
Yes, interfaces as well will be another one we'll do. But I have a good list of other topics to cover, and it seems like this was gone fairly well.
I think the one thing I was missing from this entire discussion is watching Nick go full on Kramer. You're wrong.
You're wrong.
Yeah, we've all seen Nick have an opinion on something sometimes. He has a robust defense of some of his points of view, shall we say. I think that's good. I mean, the thing is, the interest that we've had in this webinar and the fact that all of us are here and and coming up with various points of view and things like that, has made it quite clear that actually this is something that's really worth talking about. And not everybody agrees on every point, and that's quite important, I think. And I think all of us also, I don't know, I can only speak for me personally, but actually the discussion has really made me think about a few things as well that perhaps I hadn't really considered before. So, you know, that's the whole point of this. Is it's about growing our collective knowledge in some ways, and maybe crystallizing some points of view about certain aspects of the topic as well. So I think it's very good. It's very interesting. You're never too, you know, I've been a developer for 38 years, and I still learn something every day. You know, every day, and that's not being trite or clever. It's a fact. I don't think I'll ever stop learning as a developer. So, and I hope I don't, because then it'd get boring, wouldn't it? So, yeah.
But beside different opinions on some of the topics, we also agreed on some stuff, right? So in a try finally freeing a local var, this makes no sense to call FreeAndNil. I think we can all agree on that. So it's hope at the horizon. So we agreed on one item at least, right?
And can I ask?
I believe everybody nodded when Nick said there's something weird about global variables.
Yeah, that's true.
That should be another topic, by the way, that Delphi automatically, if you create a new form, you have this global variable there.
Oh, God,
that is the number one thing I pick up with customers all the time. Hey, get rid of this thing, because they literally reference that all over their application. And that's the number one problem that they get when they open multiple forms of the same class. So
and we're not talking 3 forms. We are talking 300 forms.
And then also the problem that all the public fields are by default published fields. Yes. I mean, if you drop a component on a form, everything will be published. If I recall correctly, that's because the IDE needs that to show properties in the object inspector. But I may be wrong. So for a design time feature, you let people risk to have unwanted access to your fields, to your properties. So that's another thing that could be better, I think. But I mean, I have a thing about the try finally thing, to just call free if you create an object and you have a try finally block. That I think that I myself, I would be tempted to use a FreeAndNil there, just for consistency, because I'm a FreeAndNil guy. So, I mean, I'm so used to using FreeAndNil that I would probably write a FreeAndNil there. But I think that the good point many developers should focus is that FreeAndNil is not thread safe. That given that our code is getting more and more multi-thread, that's actually a point that we should be aware, myself first.
And it's going to become even more so now that, you know, looking at the new generations of processors coming out. Speaking of multi-threading, Dahlia, could you hold your book up once more so I can go look for it on Amazon? There we go.
I have one. But it's too
far. Has them.
That's the thread safety pattern.
Excellent. Thread safety patterns, that's the one.
But they are not on Amazon. The last one is not yet on Amazon.
Okay.
It's on my website.
Yeah. You have a third one too, don't you, Dahlia? Asynchronous, I think it is.
Yes.
And then Holger shot his book hands-on with Delphi.
Well, and down in my bookshelf down here, I have all these books, by the way. So, yeah, I actually have the PDF version of Dahlia's one.
Are they available in Germany?
I don't have any copies of my books to flash around.
Yes.
So.
Okay, super.
You messed up. Yeah.
Nice.
I have to say, of these books, of late, there's been some really, really good books come out, and it's great to see that kind of renaissance of people taking time and effort to publish. And Holger and Dahlia being two examples of people recently have done multiple books, and David Cornelius as well. His book is really good as well, and actually Andrea's book on FireMonkey as well it's really nice to see that kind of what's the word I'm looking for? That volume of text being written about the language, written about the esoterics of things like memory management and thread safety patterns and design. And there you go. There's a dependency injection. See, it's around, and it's good. You know, it's nice to see that the books are good quality books as well. They've got they're very well worth having. They're not just like fluff and nonsense. Say, hey, you know, here's how to design a form. It's actually about stuff that real developers need to know about. And it's nice to be an MVP amongst the group of MVPs that are doing all this kind of thing. So I'm too lazy to write books. I'd write.
Holger was, or not sorry, Ian was working on a review of Dahlia's book, and he's been taking a while because it's a lot of stuff in there. And so yeah, the amount of effort that goes into a book and then even reviewing a book effectively is quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah, it's all good. It will be coming out on the blog soon. It'll be out sometime this week, hopefully, when I get around to it. Yeah, a problem is I have a day job, and that keeps getting in the way of doing all the other bits. Yeah, apparently people want me to actually write programs for money. I don't know what they're thinking about. And Richard Hatherall is also messaging me as well about the AWS stuff. So he's a good guy.
So sometimes I see in code free and then set the reference to nil. Is there any reason to do this by hand and not calling free and nil? Beside the var call?
Usually not, but there may be some cases when during the destruction of that object you are indirectly still referencing it, but this is usually some very nasty code. I mean, there might be some cases where such code might blow up, but very rarely.
Yeah, so as far as like doing it manually versus calling free and nil is what you're asking? It's interesting.
Yeah, I
reverse order though, right? Like we covered that at the very beginning. Like it's first being set to nil, and then being free,
right.
And that would be the plain difference in sight for me.
Yeah, you'd still have a handle to the reference, but you know what state it's in after it blows up during free. What are you going to do with that?
You can, in the destructor of that object, you might have some related other, if it's a complex structure, you might have some related objects that have a reference to your original instance, and during the destruction process it is still valid, and you have to call some code to attach something, detach, or some other processing that will not happen if you nilled the reference first. So in such cases, you should call free first and then nil it, because you cannot do anything with that reference. I mean, if you need to unregister it from somewhere with the original reference you are calling free and nil, you will not be able to do that. But this is very, very rare code. I don't remember seeing it where it was good code. But it can happen. I'm not saying it cannot happen. So if you have some reason to call free first and then nil, you probably know why you are doing it.
I would say that it goes back to what I was saying about evidence-based, right? Is that you want to make sure that what you do, if you're like, oh, I need to call free first and then nil, that there's a reason for that, right? That it's not just well, I heard Dahlia say something at a webinar about this, so I should probably do it. You know,
but you also have to remember that free and nil wasn't there from the get-go.
Right.
So, you know, that was our only option, was if we were having an object reference that was going to be reused, yes, we needed to free it, but then somebody else, other code would be checking for nil. And so we had to manually set it to nil so that check would go through. But then as we got more, multi-threaded or, dynamic processing, the time it took to free it, somebody else is checking it. Well, it's invalid and it raises these really weird exceptions. So, back in the day, Embarcadero, Borland, the RNG engineers came up with, oh, well, if we just do this, we can set the reference first and then still let the code go through. We couldn't do that ourselves, without referencing the, at object reference itself to typecast it as a T object, because that's all that it applies to. So there's some assumptions as to when free and nil works and why we have it. So in that case, yeah, it's added safety, but historically we didn't have it. So there's still a lot of code that has free and then nil because it's never gone back and been touched and updated.
Ray, do you have internal knowledge why free is not kneeling the reference by itself?
It is a manual memory management and it does nothing. There is no sense in kneeling the reference because there might be other references to it. So basically, it doesn't give you any safety and it costs some time, however small it is. But Delphi is here for 27 and something years. So back in the day, that was unnecessary call. So, and if compiler would have to track all the references, so it would kneel really every dangling reference, that would cost huge amounts. That is, I don't think this is viable today to track and check every reference. I mean, when you take a weak reference to interface reference, this weak reference tracking is costing a lot of time. So this is not something that is very fast. You don't want to do that on all code.
Nick, here's a question for you. It says, if you consider never to use free and nil, then how, or then in an event-based application, which isn't so rare, how do you avoid to create objects at unknown moments and avoid to create them twice or more? Typical case is when the user clicks on a button, which spawns a T thread. What about if the user clicks twice on the same button and the second time when the first T thread launched by this first click is not finished yet? So if you have a thread that's created when the user clicks a button and the user clicks it a second time, if you're without using nil,
and another thread would be off running. You have two threads running. Or if it's bad to click the button a second time, then you got a design problem.
Yeah, you have to disable the button once you've created your first thread, or disable the routine that creates the thread.
I was going to say that, Tom, but then my question is, why are you using T-thread if you need it to finish?
Yeah.
A T-thread should just go off and do its thing and not matter when it finishes, when it's done. It shouldn't
separate responsibility.
And if we went all the way back to Delphi 2 days, that would be anathema to begin with, because you don't ever want your visual interface touching on threads to begin with.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I lost what I was going to. I'm trying to answer the questions as I go here too. Someone suggested that I post these. I will try to. I always try to do that, but I will try extra hard to get these questions posted as well, because there's some good questions coming through as well. We are past top of the hour. I just want to give everybody a chance. If there's something you wanted to add that you didn't get a chance to say, Ray, we'll start with you. Anything you wanted to add, or thing I didn't get a chance to follow up with you on?
No, I've spoken my piece.
Okay. Nick.
I'm good.
Actually, here, just if you have something you want to say, raise your hand or whatever, or jump in. And same thing with those that aren't on camera. If you have something about that. Okay, Olaf, you want to add something?
It's a question for Nick. Did you pre-record that session at Christmas time?
That's a long story having to do with my partner's kids.
Otherwise, I'm good.
It's a battle to see who can last longer not putting down the Christmas tree.
Nice.
I thought it was like a Christmas in July thing.
No.
It saves time, actually. You know, it's like using free instead of free and nil.
Nice.
Did you say free and nil or tree and nil?
Free and nil, yeah, right.
And we know it's actually nil and free, as Dahlia points out in her book.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's been a very,
Okay.
very good session.
Great stuff.
So, we're planning on next time we will discuss the with statement and possibly go to as well. We'll see.
And
There's no discussion
how many
there.
days I
Don't
spent.
use that since basic.
I think we're all going to agree on the same thing for the go-to.
Yeah.
That's going to be a real
That's
short
a pretty
discussion.
easy discussion.
Yeah.
Consensus.
Yeah.
Well,
Unless you're still doing Visual Basic.
Do you think anybody recognized if the go-to was stipped from the Delphi language? Nobody was recognized.
Oh, yes, I know someone who will miss it. Stefan Glinka, he is using it all over the place, optimizing code. And it is really useful sometimes. It is not for regular usage, but when you have to optimize some very efficient code, it is very useful thing to
Dark
have.
arts optimization. That is it.
Yeah.
Dark arts of optimization.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Also known as black box.
Yeah.
Don't look. Just don't look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, like 70% of the code.
Yeah. It's like the ring. If you look at it, you die in 7 days.
It's, every time we get some optimizations in RTL in some functions, that is Stefan's work, and I'll bet you will find some go-tos in there. So
yeah,
we
Isn't
need
that
them.
assembler? Isn't he doing that in assembler?
No, he is writing it in Pascal code.
Hey Jim, here's
So it can be cross-platform, and he's optimizing code logic in a way. Yes, it resembles assembler, but it is written in Pascal. But that is the reason there is a go-to, because it is for quick jumping out of the logic, code logic, where it needs to go out and such stuff.
Okay.
So it mimics assembler in a way, but it is pure Pascal.
I have a new compiler message that you need to add to the next iteration. Anytime you run into goto, have the compiler emit a message. Every time someone writes a goto, God kills a kitten.
There you go.
You have too many kittens anyway, so.
And a with statement.
Exactly.
Jim, are you planning also a session about improving the Delphi language? So we can collect nice things. We talked about it, so like.
I was thinking what I'd probably do for that is have a roundtable conversation and get Marco and David involved, and then we could, have a discussion where we could make suggestions to them about things that we'd like to see improved and changed and stuff like that.
Ivan Levashev, I think is his name. He keeps comparing Delphi to Ada because apparently they're both descended from Pascal, and he wants to add all the things that Ada can do. And I'm like, I don't think that's really what we want to do. But there you go.
Ada, yeah.
Ada, great language, but not one I want to write in. Thanks. Yeah.
It's a great thing. There's lots of cross-pollination due to other languages.
That's exactly what I said. I said, like inline variables. It's like, oh, they were already in Ada. But they weren't in Pascal. And there was a good reason why I hated inline variables when they came out. Said I'm never going to use them. But actually now I can see the point and I use them. So, I'm prepared to be convinced, but
limit scope.
Takes a while.
Not this guy. No thanks.
Exactly. See, there's another argument we could all start.
Yeah.
There we go. I mean, that's another topic. And actually, David Cornelius just pointed out we didn't really discuss signed checks either, which I thought kind of went together with free and nil, but we didn't get much into talking about the signed. But we are kind of, like I said, already past top of the hour, so possibly you can discuss it some more in the future. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and we will see you all online later. Take care.
Yeah. All right.
Fantastic seeing all of you, by the way.
See you guys later.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Everybody.